A millionaire receives the devastating news that his 5-year-old son, who has been in a coma for 2 years, is showing decreased brain activity, and the doctors say there's nothing more they can do. At the height of his despair, a poor little girl timidly enters the room and whispers, "Sir, I know how to wake your son." Initially skeptical, he is stunned when she reveals she knows a special secret. Then she approaches the bed and does something inexplicable. The millionaire cannot bear what he sees before his eyes and faints on the spot. The smell of antiseptic burned Edward Morgan's nostrils as he walked through the marble corridors of St. Jude's Medical Center, the most expensive and renowned hospital in the city. His Italian shoes echoed against the impeccable floor, each step a declaration of power that failed to mask the anguish that had been eating at his chest for 2 long years. At 52, Edward had built a corporate empire based on calculated coldness and the conviction that everything in life had a price. Everything, except what mattered most now. His personal assistant had called 3 times that morning, trying to reschedule important meetings, but Edward couldn't focus on business. Not when Dr. Henry Wallace had requested an urgent conversation about the state of Michael, his 5-year-old son, who had been in a coma since the terrible accident that had changed their lives forever. Edward stopped before the doctor's office door, his hand trembling imperceptibly as he adjusted his silk tie. Behind the facade of absolute control, a storm of guilt and despair threatened to consume him. He knew this conversation wouldn't bring good news. The signs had become impossible to ignore in recent weeks. The monitors showing ever weaker brain activity, the doctor's eyes avoiding his during daily visits, the awkward silence of the medical staff. "Come in, Mr. Morgan," said Dr. Wallace, a man in his 60s whose reputation was as impeccable as it was expensive. His grave expression confirmed Edward's worst fears before a single word was spoken. Edward sat in the leather armchair, maintaining the erect posture he had perfected over decades of tough negotiations. But this time, there was no strategy that could save him. There wasn't enough money in the world to buy what he most desired, his son's awakening. "Doctor, let's get straight to the point," Edward said, his voice holding only a slight tremor. "What is Michael's real situation?" The doctor sighed deeply, removing his glasses and cleaning them with slow, deliberate movements. "Edward, you know I've always been frank with you. Michael's condition has deteriorated. The latest tests show a significant decrease in brain activity." The words hit Edward like a death sentence. He had spent millions on experimental treatments, hired the world's best specialists, built a private hospital room with state-of-the-art equipment, all of it, only to hear that his son was slipping further away from life. "What does that mean exactly?" Edward asked, though he already knew the answer. "It means we need to discuss the next steps, Doctor." Wallace replied, his voice laced with professional compassion. "Edward, the time has come to consider other possibilities. Michael is being kept alive only by the machines. There are no more signs of improvement, and medical science has reached its limit." Edward's world crumbled in that instant. All his arrogance, all his financial power, all his ability to control impossible situations proved utterly useless in the face of life's fragility. He thought of Clara, his wife Eve, who had passed away 3 years earlier, never getting to see her son awaken. He thought of the promises he'd made to her in her final moments, swearing he would care for Michael until he opened his eyes again. "No," Edward said, his voice louder than he intended. "I don't accept that. There has to be something else we can do." The silence that followed was deafening, filled only by the distant hum of the machines keeping his son alive on the floor above. Edward felt his emotional defenses crumble, revealing a vulnerability he hadn't experienced since Clara's death. In that moment, he realized he was about to lose the only connection he still had to her. Edward left the office like a man in a trance, his legs moving automatically toward the elevator that would take him to Michael's room. The 10th floor hallway seemed longer than ever, and each step echoed like a countdown to a decision he wasn't prepared to make. Dr. Wallace's words reverberated in his mind. Discuss the next steps was a cruel euphemism for the unthinkable. Upon entering the private room, Edward was enveloped by the familiar, suffocating atmosphere he knew so well. The rhythmic beeping of the machines keeping Michael alive created a mechanical symphony that had become the soundtrack to his existence. The boy lay motionless in the state-of-the-art hospital bed, his brown hair contrasting with the pallor of skin that hadn't seen the sun in 2 years. Edward approached the bed and held his son's small hand, searching for any sign of recognition that never came. "Michael, Daddy's here," he whispered, his voice breaking despite all his efforts to maintain control. "I'm not giving up on you. Ever." The nurse on duty, an experienced woman named Dolores, watched from the doorway with a look of compassion that Edward had learned to hate. It was the same look everyone gave him, pity mixed with relief that they weren't in his situation. He dismissed her with a curt gesture, preferring the solitude with his son. It was then that he heard small, hesitant footsteps in the hallway. Edward turned, annoyed by the interruption, expecting to see another member of the medical staff. Instead, he found himself facing a girl of about 7, wearing a simple, faded dress, her black hair in messy braids. Her large, dark eyes surveyed the room with a childlike curiosity that seemed completely out of place in the sterile environment. "Who are you?" Edward demanded, his voice laced with impatience. "Children aren't allowed here. Where are your parents?" The girl showed no intimidation at his authoritarian tone. Instead, she took a few cautious steps into the room, her eyes fixed on Michael. "My mom works here," she said in a soft but determined voice. "She cleans the rooms at night." A wave of irritation washed over Edward. The most expensive hospital in the city, allowing staff members' children to roam freely in the corridors. This was unacceptable. "That doesn't give you the right to enter private rooms," he scolded. "Get out immediately before I call security." But the girl didn't move. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, studying Edward's face with an intensity that was unsettling for someone so young. "You're Michael's daddy," she said, not as a question, but as a statement. Edward's surprise was evident. How did a strange child know his son's name? "How do you—" "I know how to wake up your son," the girl interrupted, her words landing in the room like a silent bomb. Edward felt the world stop around him. The sound of the machines seemed to grow louder, and the room's cold air conditioning couldn't stop the sweat from forming on his forehead. "What did you say?" the girl repeated, each word pronounced with an unnerving certainty. "I know how to wake up your son." For a moment, Edward was completely speechless. Part of him wanted to laugh at the absurdity of the situation. A poor child claiming she could do what the world's best doctors could not. Another part, the part drowning in despair, clung to those words like a shipwrecked man to a piece of driftwood. "That's ridiculous," he finally said, his voice betraying more uncertainty than conviction. "You're just a child. You don't know what you're talking about." The girl took a few more steps toward the bed, completely ignoring Edward's hostility. Her eyes never left Michael's face, as if she could see something that eluded everyone else. The girl stood motionless beside Michael's bed, her small but piercing eyes fixed on the sleeping boy's face. Edward watched her every move, torn between irritation at the intrusion and a growing curiosity he couldn't explain. There was something about the child's posture, a strange serenity for one so young, that unnerved him. "How do you know my son's name?" Edward asked, crossing his arms in a defensive stance. "And what did you mean by, 'wake him up'?" The girl turned slowly to face him, and Edward was struck by the maturity he saw in those dark eyes. "I knew Clara," she said simply, as if commenting on the weather. The name hit Edward like a punch to the gut. No one in the hospital dared mention Clara in his presence. The medical staff had received clear instructions not to touch on the subject of his deceased wife, and Edward had made sure everyone knew it was forbidden territory. Yet here was a 7-year-old child, speaking his wife's name with a familiarity that left him breathless. "You didn't know my wife," Edward said, his voice coming out harsher than he intended. "That's impossible. Clara never... She didn't mix with..." He stopped abruptly, realizing he was about to voice a prejudice that even in his emotionally fragile state, he recognized as inappropriate. The girl, however, seemed to perfectly understand what he hadn't said. "With people like me," she completed, showing no hurt or anger. "Clara didn't think like that. She taught me a special song." Edward felt his legs weaken. Clara had been an upper-class woman, educated in the best schools, accustomed to the most refined social circles. The idea of her associating with a working-class child seemed utterly absurd. Yet, there was something in the certainty with which the girl spoke that planted a seed of doubt in his mind. "What song?" he asked, almost in a whisper. The girl smiled for the first time since entering the room, a smile that lit up her face and somehow made the oppressive environment feel lighter. The song she used to sing for Michael when he was still in her tummy. The secret song that only the two of them knew. Edward's world began to spin. That information was impossible. The melody Clara hummed during her pregnancy was an intimate thing between them, something she had instinctively created during sleepless nights, stroking her belly and whispering words of love to the baby who had not yet been born. They had never shared that song with anyone. "You're lying," Edward said, but his voice spoke of desperation, not conviction. "That's impossible. Clara would never..." She sang it like this. The girl interrupted and began to hum a soft, sweet melody. Edward felt the floor disappear from under him. Every note, every inflection, every pause in the tune was exactly as Clara used to sing it. It was as if his wife were there in the room again, filling the space with her angelic voice. Edward leaned against the wall, his breathing becoming ragged as long-buried memories rushed to the surface. The girl stopped humming and looked directly at Edward. "Clara told me this song had special powers, that it could wake up people who were sleeping very deeply." "Stop," Edward said, his voice a desperate whisper. "Stop it." But the girl continued. "She said if Michael ever needed to wake up, I should sing this song to him. She made me promise." Edward slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, his composure finally shattering completely. This child knew secrets that were impossible to know, sang a song only Clara knew, spoke of promises that seemed to come from beyond the grave. He looked at Michael, then at the girl, trying to process a reality that defied everything he believed in. Edward remained on the floor for several minutes, his mind struggling to process what he had just heard. The melody still echoed in his ears, each note bringing back memories of Clara singing softly in the pre-dawn hours of her pregnancy. How was it possible for a strange child to know something so intimate and personal? "Who are you?" he finally asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. "What's your name?" "Hope," the girl replied, and Edward almost laughed at the irony. A child named Hope appearing at the most desperate moment of his life. "Hope Santos. My mom is Maria. She cleans this floor every night." Edward vaguely knew the night cleaner, a quiet woman who worked discreetly while he held his lonely vigils beside his son. He had never paid her any attention, just as he paid no attention to most of the staff he considered invisible. Now, to discover that this woman had a daughter who claimed to know Clara left him completely disoriented. "Where did you meet my wife?" Edward asked, slowly getting to his feet and brushing imaginary dust from his suit. "At the community center in Hope's Crossing," the girl replied, oblivious to the irony of her name matching the neighborhoods. "Clara came on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She helped me with my homework and taught me to read better." Edward felt as if he had been struck again. Clara had never mentioned going to any community center. Her afternoons were filled with Pilates classes, lunches with her club friends, and spa appointments. The idea of his aristocratic wife helping underprivileged children with their homework seemed like an absurd fantasy. "That's a lie," he said, but his conviction was rapidly fading. "Clara never told me anything about that," Hope shrugged with childlike simplicity. "She said it was her special secret, that some secrets are kept not to hurt people, but to protect the ones you love." Those words hit Edward in an unexpected way. Clara had always been mysterious about some of her activities, saying only that she needed time for herself when he asked about certain absences. He had interpreted it as feminine whims, never imagining there could be something deeper. "Can I try to wake Michael now?" Hope asked, approaching the bed with a naturalness that contrasted with the tension gripping Edward. "No," he said quickly, his protective instinct overriding everything else. "You can't touch him, the doctors said." "I won't hurt him," Hope interrupted, her voice carrying a patience that seemed far too old for her years. "Clara taught me how. She said love can travel through music." Edward looked at his son, then at the girl, feeling trapped between rational skepticism and a desperate hope growing inside him. For 2 years, he had tried everything money could buy. Maybe it was time to try something that cost nothing. "Just sing," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "You can sing, but you don't touch him." Hope nodded and positioned herself beside the bed. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if concentrating, then began to sing the melody Clara had created again. Her childish voice filled the room with a sweetness Edward hadn't felt in years. As he listened, Edward kept his eyes fixed on Michael's heart monitor. For 2 years, that green line had remained monotonously regular, showing only the mechanical beats of a heart that kept working without the spirit's presence. But now, as Hope's voice filled the air, Edward noticed something different. Michael's heart rate was accelerating slightly. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but definitely there. Edward leaned forward, not believing what he was seeing. Then, impossible to ignore, one of Michael's small fingers twitched. Edward blinked several times, convinced he was hallucinating. Michael's little finger had moved, he was sure of it. But now, watching intently, everything seemed to have returned to normal. The heart monitor showed a slightly elevated rhythm, but still within the parameters Edward had learned to recognize as stable over the past 2 years. "Did you see that?" he whispered to Hope, who had stopped singing and was watching Michael with an expression of deep concentration. "He's trying to wake up," she said, with the same simple certainty she had used for all her impossible statements. "But he's scared. He doesn't know if it's safe to come back." A shiver ran down Edward's spine. The way the girl spoke about Michael's state was disturbingly specific, as if she could truly perceive things that escaped medical comprehension. For 2 years, Edward had heard dozens of technical explanations about comas, brain activity, and recovery possibilities, but none had sounded as convincing as the simple words of this 7-year-old. "How do you know that?" he asked, his voice filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "Clara told me," Hope replied, as if that explained everything. "She said that when people sleep for a long time after getting hurt, sometimes they get scared to wake up because they think it'll hurt again." Those words struck Edward like a revelation. In the 2 years since the accident, he had focused exclusively on the medical aspects of Michael's condition: brain damage, neurological activity, chances of physical recovery. He had never considered that there might be an emotional aspect, that his son might, in some way, be choosing to remain asleep. Suddenly, the room felt suffocating. The reality of what he had just witnessed, the twitch of a finger, the change in heart rate, the girl's impossible familiarity with his family's intimate secrets, all converged into a wave of emotion that Edward could no longer contain. His legs gave out and he collapsed, fainting beside his son's bed. When Edward regained consciousness, he found himself lying on the room's sofa with Dr. Wallace checking his blood pressure and Hope sitting quietly in a nearby chair, watching everything with concerned eyes. "Edward, are you all right?" the doctor asked, his professional voice masking genuine concern. "The nurse called me when she found you passed out." Edward tried to sit up, his head still spinning slightly. "Michael, he moved. His finger moved when she was singing." Dr. Wallace exchanged a look with Nurse Dolores, who had returned to the room. Edward recognized that expression. It was the look they reserved for family members who were losing their minds due to prolonged stress. "Edward," the doctor said gently, "I know you want to believe there are signs of improvement, but we need to be realistic. Involuntary muscle spasms are common in comatose patients." "They don't mean—" "It wasn't a spasm," Edward interrupted, his voice gaining strength as indignation grew. "I saw it. His heart rate changed too. Check the monitors." Dr. Wallace sighed and consulted the charts the nurse handed him. Edward saw a frown of confusion form on his forehead as he examined the data. There was indeed a slight alteration in his heart rate about 15 minutes ago, the doctor admitted, but that could have several explanations. Changes in room temperature, adjustments in medication, or the music, Hope said softly, speaking for the first time since Edward had fainted. All eyes turned to her. Dr. Wallace seemed to notice the girl's presence for the first time, and Edward could see disapproval forming on his face. "Who is this child?" the doctor asked. "Children aren't allowed in ICU rooms." "She's—" Edward paused, realizing he didn't know how to explain Hope's presence without sounding completely irrational. "She knew my wife." Dr. Wallace frowned, his gaze shifting between Edward and Hope. The atmosphere in the room had changed completely, charged with a tension that went beyond the usual medical concern. Edward realized he was being evaluated not just as a desperate father, but as someone whose mental stability was being questioned. "Edward, I understand your desperation," the doctor said, choosing his words carefully, "but allowing unknown children access to Michael is not appropriate. This is a controlled medical environment, and there are protocols we must follow." "She's not a stranger," Edward insisted, though he wasn't sure how to justify that claim himself. "She knew Clara. She knows things that—" "Mr. Morgan," Nurse Dolores interrupted, her voice laced with motherly concern. "You're going through a very difficult time. It's natural to want to cling to any hope, even if it comes from a poor child," Edward completed, surprising himself with the acid in his tone. "Is that what you're all thinking?" The awkward silence that followed confirmed his suspicions. Edward realized that, in the eyes of the medical staff, he was being manipulated by a working-class child who had found a way to take advantage of his vulnerability. The idea infuriated him, not just because of the injustice of the assumption, but because a part of him feared it might be true. Hope stood up from her chair, her posture small but dignified. "I don't want to cause trouble," she said, addressing Edward. "I just wanted to help Michael like I promised Clara." "No," Edward said quickly, surprising everyone, including himself. "You're not leaving, not yet." Dr. Wallace sighed deeply. "Edward, I have to be clear. If you insist on allowing unauthorized visitors access to Michael, I'll be forced to take more stringent measures. I can have him transferred to a ward where access will be more restricted." The threat hit Edward like a physical blow. The thought of losing control over Michael's care, of seeing him transferred to an impersonal environment where he couldn't hold his nightly vigils, where he couldn't be present at every moment, was unbearable. For 2 years, this room had been his sanctuary, the only place where he still felt connected to his son. "You can't do that," he said, but his voice betrayed his insecurity. "We can, and we will, if necessary," the doctor replied firmly. "Edward, you're an intelligent man. You know that letting your emotions cloud your judgment won't help Michael." Edward looked at Hope, who was watching the entire discussion with a disturbing maturity. In the girl's eyes, He saw an understanding that went beyond her years. She knew she was being kicked out, not for doing something wrong, but for representing something the adult world couldn't accept. "All right," Edward said finally, each word costing him a piece of his soul. "Hope, you have to go." The girl nodded without showing surprise or hurt. "I understand," she said simply, "but I'll be back. I promised Clara I'd look after Michael, and I always keep my promises." As she walked toward the door, Edward felt as if he were letting his last hope slip away. "Hope," he called, and she turned. "How can I find you?" "You don't need to find me," she replied with a sad smile. "I'll find you." After the girl left, the room returned to its familiar silence. But Edward felt that something fundamental had changed. Dr. Wallace and the nurse were preparing to leave when Edward asked a question that surprised them. "Doctor, in your medical experience, have you ever seen cases of comatose patients who reacted to specific musical stimuli?" The doctor hesitated before answering. "There's some research on the influence of music on comatose patients, but the results are inconclusive." "Why do you ask?" Edward looked at Michael, still hoping to see another impossible movement. "Just scientific curiosity." 3 days had passed since Hope's expulsion, and Edward couldn't get the girl out of his thoughts. Her words echoed constantly in his mind. "I promised Clara I'd look after Michael." How could a 7-year-old have made such a specific promise to a woman who had supposedly died when she was only 4? Determined to find answers, Edward made a decision that would have been unthinkable a week earlier. For the first time in 2 years, he left the hospital during the day and drove to Hope's Crossing, the neighborhood the girl had mentioned. The contrast with his privileged life was shocking. Unpaved roads, simple houses, children playing barefoot in the dust. The community center was a modest but well-kept building with colorful walls and children's drawings decorating the facade. Edward hesitated before entering, feeling completely out of place in his $3,000 Italian suit. The center's coordinator, a middle-aged woman named Gloria, greeted him with poorly disguised surprise. When Edward mentioned Clara's name, her expression changed completely. "Clara Morgan?" Gloria asked, her eyes filling with tears. "Oh, how we miss her. She was one of our most dedicated volunteers." Edward's world stopped. "Volunteer?" "Yes. She came here twice a week for almost 3 years. She helped the kids with homework, organized activities, brought in so many donations." Gloria paused, noticing the look of shock on Edward's face. "You didn't know?" Edward sat down heavily in a plastic chair, his mind struggling to process the information. Clara, his aristocratic wife, had spent 3 years volunteering at a community center in a poor neighborhood, and he had never known a thing. "She asked us not to mention it to anyone," Gloria continued gently. "She said she wanted to keep it as her own special thing. But she always spoke of her husband and son with so much love." "And hope?" Edward asked, his voice hoarse. Gloria's face lit up. "Oh, little Hope was Clara's special project. The girl had been through some very tough times, and Clara took her under her wing like she was family. She always said Hope had a special gift for comforting sad people." Edward spent the next 2 hours listening to stories about a Clara he had never known. A woman who organized fundraising drives, who knew every child's name, who sang to soothe the little ones when they got hurt playing. It was like discovering he had been married to a stranger. When he finally left the community center, Edward drove straight to his company's office, Morgan Enterprises. He needed answers about another matter that plagued him: the exact circumstances of the accident that had put Michael in a coma. His executive assistant, Marcus, was surprised to see him. Edward had rarely appeared at the office since the accident, delegating most decisions to his trusted team. "Marcus, I need to see all the reports on the Park Avenue construction accident. Everything. Leave nothing out." 2 hours later, Edward was surrounded by stacks of documents, technical assessments, and safety reports. As he read, a horrifying truth began to form. The accident that had injured Michael wasn't a tragic fluke. It was the result of systemic negligence. The construction company had cut costs by using substandard materials for the scaffolding. Safety inspections had been falsified. The responsible engineers had warned of the risks, but their reports were ignored in favor of tighter deadlines and higher profit margins. Edward found his own signature on documents approving the cost-cutting measures. His obsession with profit, his relentless pressure for faster, cheaper results, had created the conditions that endangered his own son. But the most devastating discovery came at the end. A report dated 1 week before the accident, signed by Clara. She had uncovered the negligence and was gathering evidence to expose the truth. Her visits to the community center weren't just charity. Many of the families affected by his company's negligence sought help there. Clara had died knowing her husband was responsible for the suffering of dozens of families, and she was preparing to confront him. Edward remained in his office late into the night, surrounded by the documents that revealed the truth he had spent 2 years avoiding. Every page was an indictment, every report a condemnation of his business choices that prioritized profit over safety. The weight of his guilt was crushing. He was not just a victim of circumstance, but the architect of his own tragedy. His hands trembled as he leafed through Clara's personal notes, discovered in a folder she had hidden at home. Her delicate handwriting documented conversations with families destroyed by the negligence of Morgan Enterprises. Names, faces, stories of pain his wife had carried alone, trying to find a way to bring justice without destroying her husband. Spoke with the Santos family today? One entry read, "Dear little Hope lost her father when the scaffolding collapsed at the Elm Street project. She's only 4, but her eyes carry an ancient sadness. I promised I would look after her, that I would find a way to help all these families." Edward felt bile rise in his throat. Santos, Hope's last name. The girl who claimed she could wake Michael was the daughter of a man killed by his negligence. The cruel irony of the situation hit him like a hammer. The child, whose father he had indirectly killed, was trying to save his son. He rushed to the executive washroom and vomited violently, his body physically rejecting the weight of the revelation. When he finally managed to control himself, he looked in the mirror and saw a stranger, a man whose success was built on a foundation of others' tragedy. Back at the hospital, Edward found Michael's room cloaked in the familiar nightly gloom. He approached the bed and held his son's hand, feeling the weight of all his discoveries. "Michael," he whispered, "Daddy did terrible things, things that hurt a lot of people, including you." His voice broke. "I didn't know, or maybe I didn't want to know. My greed, my hurry, it all caused so much pain." For 2 years, Edward had seen himself as a victim of cruel fate. Now he understood he was both victim and perpetrator, caught in a cycle of consequences he himself had created. Clara had discovered this and tried to fix it, but she died before she could confront him with the truth. "Your mother was a better person than I will ever be," Edward continued, tears streaming freely down his face. "She tried to protect you from the truth about me. She tried to save the families I destroyed." The sound of soft footsteps in the hallway alerted him to a presence. Edward turned, expecting a nurse, but found Hope standing in the doorway. The girl wore the same simple dress from days before, and her large eyes reflected an understanding far beyond her years. "How did you get in?" Edward asked, quickly wiping his tears. "My mom's working," Hope answered simply. "I hear you talking to Michael every night. You talk loud when you're sad." Edward realized he'd been spending the last few nights venting aloud without realizing, his pain leaking out in confessions he thought were private. The idea that Hope had overheard his admissions of guilt left him simultaneously ashamed and relieved. "You know who I am," Edward said. "Not a question, but a statement. You know what I did to your family?" Hope nodded slowly. "I know you didn't mean to hurt my daddy." Clara explained that sometimes people do bad things without meaning to, because they're only thinking about one thing and forget to think about the others. The simplicity of the explanation, coming from a child who had lost her father to his negligence, was more devastating than any accusation. Edward fell to his knees before her, sobbing uncontrollably. "Forgive me," he begged. "Please, forgive me." Hope came closer and placed her small hand on Edward's shoulder. Clara said, "Forgiveness is a gift you give yourself, not the other person." The next morning, Edward was surprised by the unexpected arrival of his brother Robert and his sister-in-law Helen, accompanied by the family lawyer, Mr. Silverman. The trio entered Michael's room with grave expressions that immediately put Edward on alert. "We need to talk," Robert said without preamble, his voice laced with corporate authority. At 45, Robert had always considered himself the more sensible of the Morgan brothers, and his posture made it clear he was here to solve a problem. "Now is not the time," Edward replied, instinctively positioning himself between the visitors and Michael's bed. "I'm taking care of my son." Helen, an elegant woman accustomed to having her opinions respected in the most refined social circles, exchanged a significant look with her husband. "Edward, we're worried about you. About your recent decisions." "What decisions?" Edward asked, though he suspected where the conversation was heading. Mr. Silverman opened a leather briefcase and removed several documents. "Edward, it has come to our attention that there have been certain irregularities in your behavior. Hospital staff have reported that you've been allowing unauthorized access to Michael, including a child with no family ties. Furthermore," Robert added, "your absence from the company has been causing instability. Major decisions are being delayed, contracts are being lost. The shareholders are questioning your leadership." Edward felt the trap closing in around him. For 2 years, he had delegated most of the business operations to focus on Michael, but now he realized that absence was being used against him. "You don't understand what's happening," Edward said, struggling to remain calm. "There are developments with Michael that you don't know about. Are you referring to the claims about a child who can supposedly cure Michael with music?" Helen asked, her tone dripping with condescension. "Edward, that's not medicine. That's desperation clouding your judgment," Mr. Silverman intervened in a professional tone. "Edward, as your legal counsel, I must inform you that your family is considering challenging your mental capacity to make decisions regarding Michael's treatment." Edward's blood ran cold. "You can't do that." "We can, and we will, if necessary," Robert said firmly. "You're letting yourself be influenced by an opportunistic child and her family. It's obvious they see a chance to take advantage of your vulnerability." "The girl isn't taking advantage of anything," Edward exploded. "She knew Clara. She knows things about our family that are impossible for her to know." The ensuing silence was filled only by the sound of the machines keeping Michael alive. Edward realized how his words had sounded, exactly like the delusions of a man losing his sanity. Helen approached him with a look of false compassion. "Edward, darling, we understand you want to believe there's hope. We all do. But letting charlatans exploit your grief won't help Michael." "Charlatans?" Edward repeated, feeling his anger swell. "You don't even know the girl." "We know enough," Robert said. "We know she's the night cleaner's daughter, that her family has a history of financial instability, and that she conveniently appeared at the moment you're most vulnerable." Mr. Silverman placed the documents on the table. "Edward, we've prepared a petition to temporarily transfer medical decisions about Michael to Robert. It's for the good of everyone, including Michael." Edward looked at the papers, then at the determined faces of his family. They had come prepared for a legal battle, armed with rational arguments and medical backing. Against that, he had only the word of a 7-year-old child and experiences he couldn't scientifically explain. "You're taking my son from me," Edward said, his voice cracking. We're protecting Michael from emotional decisions that could harm his recovery, Robert corrected. Edward, you need help. Therapy, perhaps medication to cope with the trauma. Edward looked at Michael, then back at the family that had decided he was unfit to care for his own son. For the first time in days, he felt something other than guilt and despair. He felt a burning fury that energized him. "Get out," he said, his voice low but charged with authority. "Get out of my son's room." "Edward," Helen tried, "be reasonable." "Get out," Edward yelled, startling everyone with the force of his outburst. As they retreated, Robert paused at the door. "You have 48 hours to consider our proposal. After that, we're going to court." 2 hours after his family left, Edward received a call that completed his ruin. The voice of the hospital administrator, Dr. Marcia Edwards, was formal and implacable. "Mr. Morgan, I need to inform you that the employee Maria Santos was terminated this morning. There were several complaints about disturbances caused by her daughter on the ICU floor." Edward felt the floor disappear from under him. "Terminated? Why? She's an excellent employee." "Mr. Morgan, I understand your situation, but we cannot allow personal issues to affect the hospital's operations. The safety and well-being of all our patients must be our priority." "My family did this," Edward said, more to himself than to the administrator. "They pressured you." "I cannot comment on external pressures," Dr. Edwards replied diplomatically. "But I can confirm we received several complaints from other patients and families about disruptions caused by the unauthorized presence of a child." After hanging up, Edward rushed through the hospital corridors looking for Maria. He found her in the staff locker room, gathering her personal belongings into a plastic bag. She was a woman in her 40s, graying hair pulled back in a simple bun, tired eyes reflecting years of hard work. "Maria," Edward called, out of breath, "I am so sorry. This is my fault." She looked up, and Edward saw a quiet dignity that made him even more ashamed. "It's not your fault, sir," she said softly. "Hope has always been stubborn. When she decides to help someone, there's no stopping her." "I'll fix this," Edward promised. "I'll talk to the administration. Make sure you're rehired." Maria shook her head sadly. "You know that's not going to happen, Mr. Morgan. People like us are easily replaced. But you have the power to make a real difference." "I have no power at all," Edward replied bitterly. "My own family is trying to take control of my son from me. Then maybe it's time to stop fighting the wrong people," Maria said, closing her bag. "Hope told me what Mrs. Clara said about you, that you have a good heart, but sometimes you forget to use it." Those words echoed in Edward's mind all afternoon. Jobless and without access to the hospital, Maria and Hope could no longer help Michael. Worse, Edward realized that his attempt to protect the girl had ended up hurting the very family that most needed stability. That night, alone in the room with Michael, Edward made a desperate decision. He took out his phone and called Marcus, his executive assistant. "Marcus, I need you to do something urgently. I want you to wire $50,000 to the account of Maria Santos. She's a former hospital employee." "Mr. Morgan, this is highly irregular. I'll need documentation, justification." "Marcus," Edward interrupted, "do it now. That's a direct order." After hanging up, Edward looked at Michael and whispered, "Your father is trying to do the right thing, son. Too late, maybe, but trying nonetheless." That night, during his usual vigil, Edward heard familiar footsteps in the hallway. His heart quickened, expecting to see Hope, but it was Maria who appeared at the door. "But you didn't have to do that," she said, clearly referring to the money transfer. "Yes, I did," Edward replied. "It's the least I can do after getting you fired." Maria entered the room and looked at Michael with a maternal expression. "Hope hasn't given up on Michael. She's at home, singing Mrs. Clara's song every night, sending love through the air." "That won't work from a distance," Edward said, trying not to sound desperate. "Do you really believe love has a distance?" Maria asked, and Edward didn't know how to answer. She approached the bed and gently placed her hand on Michael's forehead. "Mrs. Clara, if you're listening, your girl is trying to keep her promise, but she needs help." At that moment, as if in response to her call, Michael made a low sound, not quite a word, but definitely a conscious vocalization, the first sound he had made in 2 years. The sound that came from Michael was so soft that Edward initially thought he'd imagined it, but Maria froze beside the bed, her eyes widening in recognition. They both stood in absolute silence, barely daring to breathe, waiting for it to happen again. "Michael," Edward whispered, leaning over his son. "Michael, can you hear me?" For a few eternal seconds, nothing happened. Then, slowly, as if emerging from deep waters, Michael opened his eyes. Not all the way, just a slit, but enough for Edward to see there was consciousness behind that gaze. "Mommy," Michael murmured, his voice hoarse from 2 years of silence. Edward felt the world spin around him. Tears streamed from his eyes as he held his son's hand, feeling for the first time in 2 years a faint pressure in return. "Michael, it's Daddy," Edward said, his voice trembling with emotion. "Daddy's here." Michael's eyes moved toward the voice, struggling to focus on his father's face. "Daddy," he repeated, and that simple word was like heavenly music to Edward. Maria stepped away discreetly, but not before whispering, "I'll get Hope." Edward didn't even notice her leave. All his attention was focused on the son who had finally returned to him. Michael tried to sit up, but his muscles, atrophied from 2 years of inactivity, couldn't support the movement. "Easy, son," Edward said gently. "You've been sleeping for a very long time. You need to get your strength back slowly." "Where's Mommy?" Michael asked, and Edward's heart broke. How do you explain to a 5-year-old that 2 years had passed? How do you tell him his mother was no longer alive? "Mommy. Mommy can't be here right now," Edward said, choosing his words carefully, "but she sent someone special to look after you." Just then, rapid footsteps echoed down the hall. Hope ran into the room, still in her pajamas, her eyes shining with joy at seeing Michael awake. Behind her was Maria, who had run the 10 blocks to her apartment to get her daughter. "Michael!" Hope exclaimed, stopping beside the bed. "You woke up!" Michael turned his head to look at the girl, a look of confusion on his face. "Who are you?" "I'm Hope," she said with a radiant smile. "Your mommy asked me to sing to you until you woke up." "Mommy asked you?" Michael asked, trying to concentrate. "But where is Mommy?" Edward and Maria exchanged a meaningful glance. It was Hope who needed to explain the inexplicable to Michael, and she did it with the natural simplicity of children. "Your mommy went to a special place where the people we love very much go when they can't stay with us anymore," Hope said. "But she didn't want you to be alone. So she taught me the secret song that only you two knew." Michael processed this information with the mysterious acceptance only children possess in the face of the incomprehensible. "Can you sing the song?" Hope nodded and began to hum the melody Clara had created. As the music filled the room, Edward saw something extraordinary happen. Michael not only recognized the tune, he began to hum along, his voice weak but in key. Dr. Wallace arrived 15 minutes later, alerted by the on-duty nurse about the anomalous situation in Michael's room. He found Edward, Maria, and Hope gathered around the bed, all humming softly, while Michael tried to follow along with bright eyes. "This is medically impossible," the doctor muttered, quickly checking Michael's vitals. "Emergence from a coma of this nature. It doesn't happen like this." "Doctor," Edward said, his voice filled with a peace he hadn't felt in years, "well, not everything in medicine can be explained by numbers and charts." Dr. Wallace couldn't disagree. Before him was a boy who had spent 2 years in a vegetative state and was now consciously participating in a song, recognizing people and responding to stimuli. It was a miracle, scientific or not. The joy of Michael's awakening lasted only 6 hours. When Dr. Wallace returned for more detailed tests, he found the boy unconscious again. This time, however, he wasn't in a deep coma. His body occasionally twitched, as if fighting against some invisible force. "What's happening to him?" Edward asked, panic returning to his voice. "His brain is in conflict," the doctor explained, analyzing the neurological scans. "It's as if there are two opposing forces, one trying to awaken, the other resisting. I've never seen anything like it." Hope, who had remained by the bed since the awakening, gently touched Michael's hand. "He's scared," she said with absolute certainty. "Waking up means accepting that his mom isn't coming back." Her words struck Edward like a revelation. For 2 years, he had interpreted Michael's coma solely as a physical consequence of the accident. He had never considered that there might be an emotional choice involved, that his son might be refusing to fully awaken to a world without Clara. It was then that Robert and Helen arrived, accompanied by 2 court officers and Mr. Silverman. They carried a temporary court order, transferring medical custody of Michael to Robert. "Edward, I'm sorry," Robert said, though his expression was more one of determination than regret. "But after today's events, it's clear your emotional instability is affecting Michael's treatment." "Instability," Edward repeated, incredulous. "My son woke up for the first time in 2 years. He opened his eyes and spoke for a few hours, and now he's worse than before," Helen retorted. "Edward, you're allowing this situation to cause more trauma to an already fragile child." Mr. Silverman presented the official documents. "The order is temporary but clear. Robert now has the authority to make all medical decisions related to Michael." Edward looked at the papers, then at Maria and Hope, who watched with growing desperation. He realized it wasn't just custody of Michael being taken from him, it was his last chance at redemption. "What will be your first medical decision?" Edward asked Robert, though he already knew the answer. "Transferring Michael to a specialized clinic in Boston," Robert replied immediately, "away from disruptive influences." "No," Edward said, placing himself between Robert and Michael's bed. "For you can't separate him from the only person who managed to wake him up." "Edward, be rational," Helen interjected. "A 7-year-old girl doesn't have magic powers. What happened today was a coincidence." At that moment, Michael began to stir in the bed, muttering something inaudible. They all moved closer to listen, and his words made Edward's blood run cold. "I don't want to wake up if Mommy's not here." Dr. Wallace checked the monitors, his expression turning grave. "The brain activity is dropping rapidly. It's as if he's choosing to return to the coma." "That's ridiculous," Robert said. "Children don't choose to be in comas." But Hope approached the bed and took Michael's hand. "Michael," she said softly, "your mommy can't come back, but she told me a secret. Do you want to know what it is?" Michael stopped squirming, though his eyes remained closed. "But she said that love doesn't die when people go away," Hope continued. "Love stays inside the hearts of the people who are left behind. And your daddy has so much love for you that you can feel your mommy's love through him, too." Edward felt tears stream down his face as he understood what Hope was doing. She wasn't just trying to wake Michael, she was teaching him how to live with loss. "It's true, Michael," Edward said, his voice breaking. "Mommy's love is here, in my heart and in yours, and we're going to take care of each other, just like she wanted." Michael opened his eyes again, this time looking directly at his father. "Will Daddy stay with me?" "Forever," Edward promised. It was then that Robert delivered the ultimatum. "Edward, you have 1 hour to say your goodbyes. After that, Michael is being transferred." During that crucial hour, Edward made the most important decision of his life. While Robert and Helen waited outside, he called Marcus and gave instructions that would shock everyone. "Marcus, call an emergency meeting of the board of directors for this afternoon. I'm resigning as CEO of Morgan Enterprises." "Mr. Morgan, you can't be serious," Marcus replied, alarmed. I'm completely serious. Also, I want you to prepare the documents to establish a compensation fund for all the families affected by accidents on our construction sites over the last 5 years. The entire amount will be drawn from my personal shares. Edward hung up before Marcus could protest and turned back to Michael, who was watching everything with eyes more alert than before. Hope remained by the bed, holding the boy's hand, while Maria watched from the door with a look of motherly concern. "And Michael," Edward said, kneeling beside the bed, "Daddy needs to tell you the truth about some things that caused people to get hurt, including you." Michael tilted his head, listening with the seriousness only children can muster for important matters. "Daddy made mistakes at work, mistakes that hurt a lot of families, including Hope's family. Her daddy died because of my mistakes." Michael looked at Hope with new understanding. "Is that why you came to help me? Even though your daddy died because of my daddy?" Hope nodded. "Clara taught me that when someone hurts you by accident, the best revenge is to help. That's how you turn the hurt into love." Edward felt his chest tighten at the girl's simple wisdom. "Michael, Daddy is going to fix everything that can be fixed. He's going to help all the families that were hurt, and he's going to take care of Hope and Maria, because they're family now." "Are they going to live with us?" Michael asked, and Edward saw genuine hope in his eyes. "If they want to," Edward replied, looking at Maria, who had tears in her eyes. At that moment, Robert entered the room with the court officers. "Edward, time's up. Michael needs to be transferred now." Edward stood up and faced his brother. "Robert, I have a proposal. Cancel the transfer, and I'll sign all the papers relinquishing control of the company. You've always wanted to run Morgan Enterprises. Now you can have it." Robert was visibly stunned. "Edward, you're not thinking clearly. The company isn't worth my son's life," Edward interrupted. "And Michael is getting better here with these people. Separating him from Hope right now would be like tearing a lifeline from a drowning man." Dr. Wallace, who had remained silent throughout the argument, finally spoke up. "Mr. Morgan," he said, addressing Robert, "I must inform you that Michael's vital signs have stabilized significantly in the last hour. From a medical standpoint, a transfer at this moment could be detrimental." Helen tried to protest, but Robert held up a hand to silence her. Edward saw an internal struggle on his brother's face between ambition and family conscience. "Are you serious about resigning from the company?" Robert asked. "Completely serious, but with one condition. A portion of the annual profits must go to a compensation fund for the families affected by our past negligence." Robert considered the proposal for a long moment. Edward realized it wasn't just greed motivating his brother, but genuine concern for his mental state. The offer to resign proved that Edward was making rational, not impulsive, decisions. "All right," Robert said finally. "Michael stays, but you agree to regular medical and psychological supervision." Edward nodded, feeling an immense weight lift from his shoulders. He looked at Michael, who was smiling for the first time in 2 years. "Daddy," Michael said, "can I call Hope my sister now?" "If she wants you to," Edward replied, and Hope nodded vigorously, her smile lighting up the entire room. In that moment, Edward understood that he had lost a fortune, but gained something infinitely more valuable, a real family, built on love and redemption instead of power and money. 6 months after that transformative day in the hospital, Edward Morgan walked through the colorful rooms of the Hope's Crossing Community Center, now completely renovated and expanded. The building that once housed only 2 small rooms had become an educational complex with a library, a computer lab, a community kitchen, and a small amphitheater where children put on plays. Michael ran through the hallways alongside Hope, his physical recovery nearly complete after months of intensive physical therapy. The 2 children had developed a bond that went far beyond friendship. They were true siblings, united by an experience no adult could fully explain, but which everyone had learned to accept as a miracle of human connection. "Daddy," "Can I show the new kids how to play Mommy's song?" Michael asked, holding a small guitar adapted for his still recovering hands. "Of course, son," Edward replied, watching with emotion how Michael had found a way to honor Clara's memory through music without being trapped by the pain of her loss. Maria approached, carrying a tray of snacks for the children. In the past few months, she had become much more than a center employee. She was its administrative director and the maternal heart of the entire operation. Edward had discovered she possessed a natural gift for organizing people and resources, turning ideas into practical reality. "The families in the neighborhood are so grateful," she said, watching the children play in the inner courtyard. "A lot of mothers have been able to go back to work knowing their kids are safe here." Edward nodded, feeling a satisfaction he had never experienced during his years as a successful businessman. The compensation fund he had established had provided not only financial settlements, but also real opportunities for rebuilding for dozens of families affected by his former company's negligence. Robert had adapted surprisingly well to leading Morgan Enterprises, implementing new safety standards that became a benchmark in the industry. Ironically, the company was more prosperous than ever, its reputation restored by the transparency and social responsibility Robert had embraced after witnessing his brother's transformation. "Mr. Morgan," a familiar voice called. It was Gloria, the center's original coordinator, now the pedagogical director of the expanded project. "The performance is about to start." Edward made his way to the amphitheater, where about 50 children were preparing to present a play they had created themselves about friendship and forgiveness. Michael and Hope stood at the center of the small stage, he with his guitar and she holding a microphone. "This song," Hope announced to the audience of parents, volunteers, and children, "was taught to us by a very special woman who believed that love can travel through music." Michael began to play the simple chords of the melody Clara had created during her pregnancy. Hope began to sing, her voice now more mature, but retaining the sweetness that had awakened Michael months before. One by one, other children joined the chorus, turning that intimate lullaby into an anthem of community hope. Edward felt tears of gratitude stream down his face. In the audience, he identified several families who had been helped by the compensation fund, people who had every reason to hate him but had chosen forgiveness and collaboration instead. After the performance, while helping to organize the chairs, Edward was approached by a man he recognized as Joseph Santos, the widower of one of the victims of his company's accidents. "Mr. Morgan," Joseph said, extending his hand, "I wanted to thank you, not just for the money, but for giving my family the chance to turn our pain into something positive." Edward shook the offered hand, feeling the symbolic weight of the gesture. "Joseph, I'm the one who should be thanking you. You all taught me that true wealth isn't in what we accumulate, but in what we share." As the sun set over Hope's Crossing, Edward watched Michael and Hope playing in the courtyard with other children, their laughter echoing off the center's colorful walls. Clara would be proud, he thought. His wife had planted seeds of kindness that had blossomed far beyond what she could have ever imagined. The arrogant millionaire had died in that hospital 6 months ago. In his place, a man was born who understood that sometimes you have to lose everything you think defines you to discover who you truly are.